And a very good morning to everybody, and welcome to our session, Caring for Our Consumers, End of Life and Palliative Care. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joining you today with my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Irene Stein from Anchor Excellence, and of course the fabulous Rachel Wass, the CEO of Meaningful Aging Australia. And we've, as I said, absolutely thrilled to be joining you today. We've got a really wonderful webinar lined up, which we're going to take you through over the next hour. And really, we wanted to share some of our own personal experiences. We'll obviously deal with some practical elements, but we really wanted to use today's session in line with Palliative Care Week to draw on some of our personal experiences and really be able to give you some things to think about as you go about your day today and the way that you continue to impact and support people through the end of life and palliative care stage. I will just let you know that this is a pre-recorded session, so we won't have any of the Q&A functions, but of course towards the end of the webinar we will have our contact details. So if there's anything at all that you'd like to contact us about or follow up with, we'd be absolutely delighted to hear from you. Before we get officially started with the webinar, I'd like to acknowledge country, and in the spirit of reconciliation, both Meaningful Aging Australia and Anchor Excellence acknowledges the traditional custodians of this country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. So again, a very warm welcome. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Irene Stein, who's going to take you through some of the objectives for today's session.
Thanks, Carla. It's really great to be here. We've got over 750 people listening to this session. It is absolutely exciting because the 750 people are from all over Australia. We've got remote communities, we've got rural communities, we've got regional communities, and we've got metropolitan communities that have subscribed to this session. So indeed, an extremely warm welcome. We do know that it's National Palliative Care Week, and we're excited and honoured to be able to present this to you at this time. What we're going to be looking at is your role in palliative care in aged care. And we just don't mean residential care. We are going to kind of embrace the community setting as well. What spiritual care means in a palliative care context, the importance of individual assessments in spiritual care planning, the importance of cultural and spiritual care, and we're going to look at the lived experience, and both Rachel and Carla are going to speak from their heart about their lived experiences, and it's I think that'll be a very, very positive session. Rachel's going to discuss the National Guidelines for Spiritual Care in Aged Care, which is a seminal publication of Meaningful Aging Australia. And then we're going to suggest some resources to you that will help you embed spiritual care into your everyday practice. As I said, it's National Palliative Care Week, and the theme this year is Matters of Life and Death. It's Australia's largest awareness-raising initiative to help people understand what palliative care can do, the very positive aspects of it, particularly when people engage with it with a life-limiting illness and the positive impact it can have on families. As I said before, we're delighted to present this webinar as our contribution to National Palliative Care Week, and we dedicate this webinar to all people that make an outstanding contribution to high quality palliative care provision and for the people that receive this care. It would be remiss to have any sort of presentation without looking at the aged care quality standards. I could go through each of these standards in detail, but I guess my take-home message for this is that spiritual care actually underpins all the standards. Without good spiritual care and spiritual assessment, and we're going to talk about what spiritual care actually looks like very shortly, none of the other standards could actually stand. We know that choice, decision-making and consent are very important, and we know that different people express that in very many different ways. We know that we need services and supports for daily living to promote and support expressions of spirituality. We know that we have to have the human resources that have the adequate qualifications and profile to be able to support spiritual care. And we know very much that governance underpins all of that. But essentially and centrally, it's all about consumer dignity and choice. So let's have a quick run through what your role in palliative care in aged care could look like. Excuse me. We do talk a lot about the physical aspects of palliative care, and much of the education that you receive or have exposure to is about the physicality of palliative care. And that's why we've tried in this seminar to actually take it in a slightly different direction. But it would certainly be remiss, again, not to look at some of the physicality related to palliative care. And it is far more than meeting physical needs of a person or a family. Although physical care and service delivery is a very important part of palliative care. And some of the physical care aspects that you would hear talked about quite often in your service are related to personal care, pain management, very important, particularly toward the end stages of the palliative journey, wound management, skin care, respiratory management, because we know that that can be quite distressing as death is approaching, and of course, nutrition and hydration and the rightful place of that in that context. I'm not going to go through each of those individually, but we know that each of those has a direct tie back to the aged care quality standards and the documentation related in that context. But while you do these things, meeting palliative care, it goes much further. And I guess you have to be bold and you have to have confidence in having dialogue as people are on a death trajectory to talk about spiritual needs, spiritual care, and particularly looking at spiritual distress. Quite often the person that is dying doesn't have spiritual distress. It's the people around them that express spiritual distress. So knowing how to have a discussion with them and to support them through that is critical in palliative care. Thanks. So I'm going to hand this on to Rachel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Irene, and also to Carla and Anchor Excellence for making this session possible and inviting Meaningful Ageing Australia to be present. So what does spiritual care mean in a palliative care context? Meeting palliative care needs includes recognition of spiritual care for every single individual. It's part of the holistic care that is essential for us as we care for older people. They are going to be very different for every single person. We need to be able to allow someone to express that. It is a human right. And certainly as it comes to the end stage of someone's life, to be able to support them through that. As Dr. Irene mentioned, that also extends to those family members and people surrounding a person who is dying, because they sometimes really, this might be the first time that they've ever confronted something like this in their lives. So spiritual care needs can be expressed in a number of different ways. And that can cover anything from reflective practices such as meditation or yoga. It could be prayer. It could be taking sacraments, reading sacred texts. It could be things like wearing special clothing. It could be items of religious significance that someone needs to have in their room and around them. But it also extends to things like music, the environment, nature, and connections to people and spiritual practitioners that may also assist them. So this is obviously a very individualized aspect. and a part of cultural diversity too. The importance, therefore, of having individual assessments in spiritual care planning is really essential. We want to be able to make that component of ensuring holistic care and aged care actually happens. And it's in compliance with the aged care quality standards and the national guidelines in spiritual care and aged care. So you'll see here an example of an Australian version of a spiritual care assessment called Connect 2. And that's a validated spiritual assessment tool that you can use today to integrate into your models of care. And if you've followed me at all on LinkedIn, you'll know that we've got some exciting news to share today, and that is that we've had a recent publication in the Journal of Religion, Spirituality and Aging around the validation of this tool. And really what the key here is, again, is saying that understanding more about an older person's spirituality is important when they begin an engagement with organisations providing care just as much as the end of life. So the recent research really sought to determine the validity of Connect 2 as a spiritual screening tool across that spectrum. And the tool enables care providers to gain some understanding of the spirituality of an older person entering care, receiving home care, or at palliative care time. So another great, excellent tool I also would mention is a spiritual assessment tool for First Nations called Good Spirit, Good Life. And that embeds spirituality and connection to country, community, and spiritual care as the heart of the aged care model and palliative care. So I think there's a great opportunity there. Please do reach out to us, both at Anchor Excellence and Meaningful Aging Australia, to sort of unpack some of those. And we can look at in more detail some of those elements and how they relate to the various standards of care to give a personalised journey and care plan that embraces both the physical, social and spiritual support. Okay, I'm going to pose a little bit of a question to you. And you're right, there's not a typo there in this statement. Are we dying to live or living with dying? Sometimes in life and in your work, you can have moments where two worlds kind of connect. And very much in my case recently with the death of my mother, on the 14th of January this year. And I think that if we really want to connect to making the most of our lives and I guess that carpe diem type of philosophy, we really do need to also understand that part of living is also going to be dying. And in a Western context, we've lost a little bit of that contact and witnessing and being part of the changing of those thresholds of major milestones, including dying. But if we do get to know more about dying, embrace this as a part of our life in a way that I guess there's less fear, there's more understanding, we actually can turn that process of dying into something of transformation. It can help us heal, and it can certainly make us live life more fully. So let's actually have a look at a case, and I'll present to you a little bit about Mum's story. So in this context, what I will do is just clarify something for us, because I can understand there would be some people on this session that may not be clear on these two terms, spiritual care and spirituality. So let's begin by looking at that. People certainly have very different religious and cultural backgrounds that can influence how someone feels about the dying process. And depending on their beliefs, certain practices, rituals and customs that we've already mentioned, they can be steps along the end of life timeline. Spirituality describes a broad sense of what's important to an older person and what kind of makes them feel whole. Whereas spiritual care ensures that an older person's spirituality is supported. Hence those kind of tools, those assessment tools, as being vital ways to capture that and integrate into the way that we deliver care. Spirituality is a human right, and the UN Convention says all persons have the right to think freely and to entertain ideas, hold positions based on conscientious or religions or other beliefs. Now, here's the other important aspect that the UN says is that they interpret religion to include theistic and atheist beliefs, and that right also includes the right not to profess any religious belief. So it's a very broad sense. Spiritual care is about improving spiritual dimension of the whole of a person, including recognizing when there is spiritual distress, as Dr. Irene mentioned earlier. It's about what fills a person's cup. So think about you right now. When do you feel most at peace? Is it in nature? Is it walking by a beach? Is it reading poetry, listening to music? Is it creating or looking at art, beautiful works of art? Is it being of service to others? Is that how you feel most at peace? Connecting to something greater. And that can include your faith or beliefs. Or is it meditation or reflective practices, being with family or friends? So just have a moment to think about that, because this is what we want to integrate into our care needs for people when they are at that time of end of life and palliative care. So let's now go to the next slide. I want to share with you my mother's story. As I mentioned, she died 14th of January this year, and I was her primary carer for 15 years. There's key aspects that we're still struggling with to support older people in care in our home, and this was felt even more greatly in the palliative care journey with my mum. And my interactions with work, as I said, knowing what I know and how that sort of was brought through. But I will also mention here, and a shout out to the palliative care providers and healthcare practitioners that I've encountered not only over the years in my work, but also during mum's care. They're the most incredible people, and they often know the importance of this holistic healthcare. And, you know, it is the future of care and have a lot to share. So thank you to any of those who are attending the webinar today who work in the field and are in that moment of direct care delivery. We thank you so much. So I say that mum is my hero. This is a bit of a snapshot of mum's history and background. You'll see that she's a survivor of war, of domestic violence, one of the bravest people I know. After having the privilege of bearing witness to her death and dying, she truly is my hero. She's 75 years of age, diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. And after COVID-19 and being mum's sole support to her cancer treatment earlier, I did take the opportunity for us to move closer to my little brother, who's in the picture there, you can see on the side there next to my mum, so that mum could develop and form a closer relationship with her grandchildren. It wasn't easy to move, and particularly moving with a parent during this time, but we made it. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, spirituality encompasses many aspects of a person's cultural and unique, diverse life. It's what fills your cup, and one of those aspects can be someone's faith or beliefs. I just want to point out here in this photo, so you'll see my mother there is in the middle on the bed. She's in palliative care at this time. She had an unshakable faith in God. Mum was Catholic, and both her and her little brother, who's behind her, directly behind her there, my uncle, both went to Catholic schools, primary and secondary school, and very active with the local parish in country Victoria. My little brother is an atheist and a very beautiful, compassionate father of two, and I'm a lifelong Buddhist practitioner. And I will mention here, though, there's no way of testing it out. I think Mishka, the little wonder dog here in the photo, has to be a practitioner of unconditional love. So let's have a look now at, I guess, the medical events that occurred during Mum's palliation. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll look at the trajectory of death. And this is really important. I think no one on the session today would expect that an older person with a life-limiting illness will have the same experience, nor will death follow the same sort of timing. And there's some graphs here that I'd like to just kind of point out to illustrate this. The first trajectory you'll see, this one is commonly in a cancer scenario. There's a slow, steady progression of the disease, and then a clear, rapid terminal phase you'll see there in that diagram. It drops away. In the second trajectory, this is commonly found in situations such as respiratory and heart diseases. There's a gradual decline, and it's interspersed with these episodes of acute deterioration and then a kind of bounce back. But after each episode, there may be some recovery, but never reaching the previous level of the past episode of care. And then the third trajectory you see there, which is often found in the frail elderly or those with dementia, sadly. So this is where you've got this prolonged gradual decline. Still, there are consistent markers and some predictability of the clinical indications that a person is dying. And I think that you can see here that these experiences are very different. So really my question here is, why do we wait necessarily to think about a person's spirituality and spiritual care needs until often the very, very end? And now we'll go to the clinical timeline of events for Mum. I'm sorry this slide is a little bit small here, but follow with me. I wanted to offer some medical context on Mum's case. Mum's cancer was stage 4 advanced, but localized to the left breast and neck. And she'd undergone treatment, as I kind of alluded to, in 2021, including a mastectomy. But in 2022, another lump appeared on Mum's neck, and it turned out the cancer had returned. By this stage, it spread to her brain, her lungs, her liver, pelvis, and spine. New cancer treatment plans were developed with some wonderful team of people. New drugs were tried to buy time. And after all, we'd only just moved to Sydney 6 months prior, and, we'd come out of those lockdowns in Melbourne. But Mum's illness was quite painful, persistent, and plagued with enduring nausea. Lots of anti-nausea treatments and combinations were tried. And I know many of you will understand that this is a common issue. Lots of drugs in pumps and cascades of protocols, albeit, gave a little bit of relief, but really did not allow her to hold down too much in terms of nutrition. So I cared for Mum at home during this time, a lot of this period, giving infusions of drugs, managing her chemo appointments and radiotherapy to her brain and her pelvis. Eventually, the active radiotherapy and chemo treatment stopped. We had lots of trips to emergency departments and unfortunate falls that led to adding more complexities, a broken arm, an indwelling catheter and leg bag, a nausea pump, and 21 different medications around the clock. By this time, palliative team, a community nursing team was assigned until it sort of came to a final situation where a final round of chemotherapy intersected with a latent UTI from that indwelling catheter. So eventually this landed Mum back into emergency, and she was transferred across to the cancer hospital. It was now discovered her hip had started to crumble and she faced a hip replacement. So I'm telling you all of this, I guess, so that you can understand all the events that were occurring and the challenges, I guess, in supporting Mum as family. It was a difficult choice for all of us in terms of going through with the hip operation, but Mum agreed to that and felt it was the best thing. So it was successful. And now the period comes where the best things happened. After she was transferred into a rehabilitation hospital that was designed for gerontology, for geriatric care, there was also an end-of-life ward underneath there. And there was a very special thing that happened. A physician came, a specialist came to see Mum, and Mum was absolutely floored, delighted, felt dignified and respected. And that palliative care specialist, when they came to see Mum, said, "Helena, tell me your story. I want to know about you. I want to know how I can help you." That makes me a little teary, I'm sorry. The reason why I'm teary about that is because you can see that whole medical range of events that had occurred, but nowhere along the journey up until that point did someone ask her those questions. And I had to be her advocate, telling her story along that pathway. So this was something quite remarkable. Now, there's also something remarkable, and that is that if we go to the next slide, please, Carla, I want to contrast that medical event timeline with a spiritual timeline. And as we thought about those trajectories, those graphs as well, that the timing of someone's spiritual needs can actually be quite different. So I really think about this as Mum's journey now approaching the altar, because now she was in the palliative care environment. Visitings was open-ended. We could come and bring and make food that, you know, if Mum could take a mouthful just to taste, or a sip of water. The family pet, Mishka, you saw before, she could come. We could fill the room with flowers. We could stop focusing of when and what and where for medical appointments. And, you know, Mum was very much aware prior to this period of time. In fact, she was pretty aware at the point where she felt the lump on her neck growing before diagnosis of metastatic cancer, that she was more than likely dying. And this actually triggered off a very intense period of Mum in her spiritual intensity, her interest, her research. Mum really doubled down on her spiritual care needs. She prayed a lot more. She was really interested in discussing about what happens when you die. And this was a very important thing, but it was also a point where we now had time to be with Mum like never before. We had time to have conversations. Mum had time to make amends with people she'd had, you know, difficult relationships with. So we got to know Mum in a very different way. You know, so again, we may not expect that spiritual care will track evenly in sync with along the medical timeline. Mum was really aware that this was a time for her to clarify things, to restore relationships, and very much connect with her spirituality. She was not surprised when all the interventions were exhausted. She had already started that internal inquiry and refinement. She was really gracious and very thankful for any of the medicines, any of the caregivers, the doctors, the nurses, the people who did the cleaning in her room. She identified prayers she wanted said. She took phone calls. There was a beautiful conversation with my Buddhist teacher. She took sacraments with a Catholic priest. And all along the way, up until really that palliative period of time, the medical practitioners and systems really didn't want to kind of give up on Mum. They kept trying to ask her to eat a little more, to move a little more, to take another tablet. But I think that as we reach that palliative care situation where that beautiful specialist asked those important questions, you know, that was a real turning point. I'll share just one other thing before we move on from this slide. Mum took a call from my Buddhist teacher, and he reminded her that her body had served her well. And this was really important. He made her laugh, and he made us laugh and be joyous during this time. He told her fine things were made in Germany, which is where she was born, in the prison camp. And he reminded her that her life had been deeply valuable, that she was a good person. And he asked her something really surprising at first to me. He said, if your energy and your health was restored tomorrow, is there something she would want to do? And she took a moment, and then what she said in her response took my breath away. She said, I'd help the homeless people seeking refuge. So that was a very special thing. She also had a beautiful Catholic priest visit. She started taking a lot more sleep now, conserving energy. My uncle and brother and me, myself, in a family room a few doors down, after one of the final conversations and anointments with the priest, we could hear a distinct surge of energy from Mum, who wasn't speaking a lot at this time, but a stream of words flowed, a confession she needed to make. And the priest assured us that, you know, Mum was ready and was prepared to die. For me, Mum was becoming quite luminous. She kind of displayed some signs of spiritual maturity according to Fowler's stages of faith. And those stages describe a person's kind of religious or spiritual socialization, exploration, engagement. And then finally, Mum was demonstrating a refinement of her spiritual self through this process. And then on the last day, I took a call from the end of life team to come in. Mum was now unresponsive. Her eyes were closed, but it was very close. So my uncle and I took turns. We came in, we took turns at saying her Catholic prayers together. The room felt deeply peaceful. It was like a church inside the room. Mum's breath became shallower now, and I knew that hearing was the last thing to go. She showed a little bit of agitation at that period, but as we started to recite the prayers, she settled, and I knew she could hear us. I reminded her about the Buddhist teacher's words and told her my brother was on his way. And we put her rosary beads around her chest and the cross in her hands. And I knew she was waiting for my brother to arrive. And literally just as he arrived and sat next to her bed, Mum exhaled for the last time. So at this point, I informed my brother and my uncle quietly that this was her last breath. And we got to stay with Mum for a good 15, 20 minutes, being with her body. We noticed the changes in her skin and the reality that now she was gone. It was only when a nurse entered with medications that we kind of remembered to tell the staff that she had died. The priest returned, gave her another anointing, and assured us Mum's soul was at peace. I was calm for weeks afterwards. After this, there was some type of relief that there was no suffering, but in particular, it was a different feeling altogether. Spiritual care helped my mother and all of us to witness this death. A part of living will be dying. And I thought of the other people in the other rooms around the ward, and that's where I will kind of leave it there about Mum's journey. But I think that, you know, we really do need to consider about spiritual care being part of someone's care way before this point. Thank you for allowing me to share that.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And gosh, there are a number of times during you sharing your experience where I really reflected on what I'm going to talk about now, and I thought, yeah, it is so important to be able to be there to support people with that really at the end of life process. So thank you for being so brave and sharing your story. As I said, I'd like to share my personal lived experience about my dad, and I'm going to do my best as well not to kind of crumble like a piece of chalk. But here we go. Let's give it my best. So I wanted to share with you the story about my dad. And I guess the reason that I wanted to talk about it, particularly in the context of this webinar, is that he was actually, he died when he was 64. So to give you a little bit of context, he was a 64-year-old Filipino Australian man, and he was divorced and he had repartnered. In terms of his spirituality and faith, he was raised as a Roman Catholic lad, and he'd always, through his Filipino connection, had some connect to going to church and prayer. But it wasn't really until his later life and after his diagnosis, which I'll talk about, where he moved and developed his faith in broader Christianity. And I'm going to talk about that shortly. He had 2 children. So my brother and I, my brother living in Poland, absolutely proud grandfather of 5 children. And when you know, Rachel, when you talk about things that fill your cup, there is no question that the grandkids did that for my dad. He had 4 henpecking sisters. And if anybody's from a Filipino background, I know that you will absolutely connect that sisters are really quite something quite different in the Filipino context, particularly if you're an only boy in the family. One of the complicating and amazing factors actually in my dad's experience is that his mum is still alive. So my grandma is 90, she turned 90 this year. And that was another element of, I guess, complexity in my dad's case that we had to try and navigate through and support my grandma with. And that's another component where spirituality was very important. He migrated to Australia as a young man, and for anyone who met my dad, he was pretty charming and pretty charismatic. He wanted to be friends with everybody, and that certainly turned into be one of his passions in life, about his friends, spending time with his friends, his family, and particularly towards the end of his life, prayer and nature, and in particular sunrise. And I'll tell you a little story about his connection to sunrise and that connect to spirituality. As I've said, he really renewed his faith and faith practices during his illness. And that was something that I was, as somebody who also grew up as a Christian, but I haven't really had a strong practicing faith. So for me, that was something that I was able to reconnect with and lean on, and being able to not only support my dad, but also it was absolutely a platform of strength for me. In terms of my dad, he was absolutely afraid of death and dying. And I think if I reflect on one of the points that we put in the objectives, is for us as health practitioners to be able to be confident about supporting people with the death and dying conversation. He never really quite got there. But I know that my interactions with a number of health practitioners certainly made a difference. He absolutely was not ready to acknowledge the end of life process. And I guess my reflections really over the last 12 months, my dad died in April last year. One of my reflections over the last 12 months in the work that we certainly do with our Anchor Excellence clients in the palliative care and end of life care space is that some people actually never quite get there. It's not that people are in denial. It's actually just that they're not ready to acknowledge that. So for me, that's been an absolute aha moment. And something that I'm very conscious of when we talk to families, and when we listen to the way that people might talk about the end of life process. Please give some consideration to the fact that it's not people are in denial. It's actually a really difficult process to work through. In terms of my dad's clinical timeline, so my dad received a stage 4 bowel cancer diagnosis in January of 2019, and in somewhat of an ironic situation, it was on New Year's Day, where we're all supposed to be happy about starting a new year, but he received that very difficult diagnosis. I remember very clearly, he called me from the emergency department. He'd been experiencing some pain in his abdomen over time. My dad was the kind of person who probably didn't listen to the clinical signs as much as he should have, and he'd been ignoring a few lumps and bumps over the last few months. But he did present and received a stage 4 cancer diagnosis. What happened in the next 3 months after that was a bit of a whirlwind. So it was a process of surgery, it was commencement of chemo, and from a younger man, really, in his 60s, the changes to his day-to-day function. So with a bowel cancer diagnosis, my dad's surgery led him to have a colostomy bag. So from a physicality, you're dealing with image changes. At the point of my dad's diagnosis, he was engaged in full-time employment. He loved work. It was one of the other things that he loved, and it's where he got a lot of joy and satisfaction. So to have not only a massive health diagnosis change, but a total impact to your day-to-day life was something that was hit my dad like a ton of bricks. Rachel, when you talked about your mum, you talked about the fact that she was absolutely your hero, and I can relate to what you said, because there was an element with my dad where he just kind of got along with it. For many people, it would have, I think, broken them a lot earlier, but what I saw in my dad was his absolute resilience to keep going and try and get through this and connect again back into his faith and spirituality to really help him to get through this difficult time. What he genuinely believed, really up until the week before he died, that he still had hope of getting through this. Over about 6 to 12 months, we saw a pretty slow deterioration, which culminated in a scan in December of last year, which led to the year prior to him dying, which led to his early retirement. So the scan had showed that his cancer had metastasized, had spread to other parts of his body. The oncologist that we had spoken to really said there's no other types of treatment. My dad had exhausted all sorts of treatment, and the recommendation was a referral to the palliative care team to look at palliation and what the next trajectory would look like. As you can imagine, that was a very stunting conversation for my dad, which again threw the whole family into chaos. From a spirituality point of view, again, I know that my dad absolutely connected in with his faith, with his pastor. He had a lot of regular conversations with his pastor from the church, and that conversation, an ongoing conversation, was something that gave my dad a lot of strength right until the end of his life. He had multiple hospital visits. I highlighted the fact that Dad really wasn't ready to deal with the fact that, end of life was coming. So he did want to continue being treated in hospital. He had some more changes to his chemotherapy, which was really not looking to cure anything, but it was to give quality of life. And then we ended into the dying phase. And again, Rachel, if I think about your trajectory graph, it was so typical of that cancer trajectory that happened for my dad. So if I think about early retirement, Dad retired in January 2022, and he died in April 2022. So it was a very quick trajectory towards end of life care and dying. To have a look at, Rachel, again, using your timeline that you looked about here, for my dad, I know that he absolutely spent the last 3 months of his life being really purposeful about making peace with people, healing relationships that might have been fractured over a number of years, connecting in particular with my brother, who, by virtue of the fact that he's been living away from home, distance has made things very difficult with my dad. So he was able to find peace in those relationships. And I've highlighted there that he also connected in enormously with nature. And one of his favourite things was sunrise. And I tell you this story because probably in the 6 months leading up to his death, he would often go down to Brighton Sands in Sydney, and he'd be there early for the sunrise. He loved planes and sunrise, so you get the perfect combination there down at Brighton Sands. And he used to watch the sunrise, and I actually remember he sent me some videos of him praying at the same time as watching the sunrise. And that's a really important memory for me to have. And again, connecting into his final stages of life. Dad was unfortunately in hospital when he took his last breaths, but we were able to do everything for him and connect him into spirituality. His pastor came to, he was there pretty much for the last 24 hours of my dad's life. We were able to connect my brother in via a video call. Rachel, similarly to you, I was able to pick up on the fact that my dad was entering those last breaths of his life. So I was able to call my brother. As luck would have it, I don't think there's anything lucky about it. I think my dad knew it was around the time that the sun was rising. So we were able to open up the blinds. My brother was there on the video call. My brother was able to talk to him. Rachel, as you've said, hearing is the last sense that goes. And we were absolutely able to spend and enjoy the sunrise with my dad as he took his last breaths. So really for me, being able to know that Dad made peace, Dad found prayer, Dad reconnected in with his faith and was able to find something bigger than his own life. He connected in with nature. That gives me a lot of peace to know that he mostly ended his life in the way that he would have wanted to. So the things that, whilst that's obviously quite two fairly heavy and emotional stories, I do hope that you got something out of those stories, and you can use these considerations now. We bring it back to a really practical element of some things for you to think about as you continue to care for people, whether it be in a residential aged care service, whether it's in a hospital environment, whether it's in a home environment. Always remember that the focus should always be on the person at all stages through the journey. And whilst that might sound like an obvious thing, I think Rachel highlights there that it probably wasn't always that way for her mum. So regardless, always make sure it's about the person. Plan as much as possible for the future. And again, this involves having those difficult conversations and what to expect and anticipate, and really how you as carers and providers of such an important service can prepare your clients, the people that you care for, and the people who are important to them. Support that renewed dedication to faith and preference for spiritual care. And again, not everybody practices their faith or is spiritual for their entire life. Some people go through periods where their faith is much stronger than others. So really tap into when people have renewed faith and a desire to connect within their spiritual care. The thing that I really found important with my dad is having those difficult conversations incrementally if needed, and being able to put some of those words that you take out of those conversations into a bit of a memory bank and put the pieces all together. So my point there is not everyone will have every conversation will have a complete outcome. Sometimes you just have to take little steps to get to where you want to be. Acknowledge that people have different ways of acknowledging what is happening. And this is, again, connecting to that point around everyone gets there at a different time. see how you can connect people in. And obviously with my experience, it was around having people face to face in the hospital towards the end of my life's dad, but also virtually. And COVID has taught us many things, but if COVID's taught us anything, the power of being able to connect with people virtually is something that we should really try and apply all the time. Rachel, I'm going to leave these 2 points to you because I think these are actually right up your alley to talk about. And then Irene, I'll open up to you to see if there's anything else that you'd like to add in there.
Thank you so much, Carla, and for sharing your dad's journey. That was really meaningful for me too. I've got a point there around See Me, Know Me, because that is that's a tool that Meaningful Aging Australia has available, which is free for anyone to download. And what that has is some questions that stimulate some discussions with an older person and really allows them to tell their story. And, you know, that's something obviously I'm pretty passionate about. And a lot of people, if you initially say, you know, tell me about yourself, they may not necessarily have, you know, feel that their life has been all that special. But through using some of these kind of prompts and questions, that can help to kind of open things up. And of course, once that moment has started, it often then unfolds and, you know, leads you down some beautiful, amazing pathways. And I think those kinds of tools are great in that sense. And then also that element about allowing the ability to take time to reconcile with faith and family. And Carla, your examples of that happening for your father is so true. And you know, I know that those people attending today, watching this webinar, you'll know those examples. And it is one of those aspects of our lives. Sometimes we shut things away, and it's not until you really come to these moments where there is no more hiding, there is no more of that time where, you know, animosity or challenges are there. There's no purpose to those. And I think allowing and making space for that, if that person wishes to do that, of course, then there can be some incredible healing that can happen when there's the ability to reconcile. So thank you very much for allowing me to mention those last two things as well.
Ladies, that was amazing. It was awesome. And I just want to really thank both of you for sharing something that's truly personal and very deep. There was comparisons, there was contrasts in how spiritual care was seen and applied. And I think having the courage to actually engage at that level is really, really important as somebody is and their families transitioning to the final stages of their life. We did post some reflective questions that we'll take a look at if you and I guess the first question is, are we willing to set aside the human right to express the fullness of spirituality throughout an older person's life? And I'm just going to toss this one back to Rachel so she can talk about the national guidelines and how they're mapped to the aged care quality standards. I personally have found that document to be extremely powerful, and it has really assisted me both as a manager and as a person who works in aged care to fully understand how central spirituality and spiritual care are to the aged care quality standards. And surely that has to be a context we explore. So I might toss that one back to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Dr. Irene. Yes, look, the National Guidelines for Spiritual Care and Aged Care, you know, that was a groundbreaking world first guidelines for practitioners. And I think really its time has come for us to kind of re-embrace this, and using the opportunity of Palliative Care Week and other times in the year to really start to recalibrate and look back at it. Those guidelines, absolutely, it does look at a number of domains, everything from corporate governance of an organisation to HR and recruitment, but it very much does map back to the aged care quality standards. So if you think about, I guess standard 1, maintaining an older person's identity, spiritual care is hugely part of that. Helping older people to make connections with others in standard 1, partnering with consumers in standard 2, optimizing health and well-being in standard 2, 3, and 4, understanding what's right for each consumer, standard 3. I can go on, but I think, really right through to the palliative care side of things, that we want to create a sense of belonging, safety, and comfort for people, and to live life the best way that they can as they pass through these thresholds of living and dying. So please do tap into the national standards, talk to Anchor Excellence. They have an amazing team who can help you to integrate that into your practices. Thank you very much, Irene.
Thanks, Rachel. These questions will let you personally answer the following questions. How willing are we, or you, for example, to trust and respond to an older person's timeline of approaching death, bearing in mind the individuality of that timeline that may not match the clinical one? And I think, both Carla and Rachel did explore that in their commentary. And how do we take what's good in palliative medicine and influence practice across aged care with those really good things? Everybody deserves a good death, whatever that might be for that person. So how do we take what's really, really good and make it work for that person? And I guess...
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you there?
Yes, of course you can, Rachel.
I wanted to add in particular to that one, if I may. But that question that specialist had said to Mum, asking about her story and what he could do for her and what he could learn from her, is something that really improved the quality of her life and integrated so much. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just...
Oh, no, that's okay, because it's a fantastic segue, Rachel, into the final reflective question. How can we make every last minute as good as it can be? And I think, for me personally, that comes from deeply knowing the person that you're providing care to and their families, and striving for the very best practice that you can, evidence-based practice that you can deliver. So please take these reflective questions on board. You'll get the slide deck at the conclusion of this. But again, a huge thanks to both of you for having the courage to share your stories with so many people. We were just proud to be co-partnering with Meaningful Australia to have been able to present this webinar. Before we go, there's a list of useful resources that you will receive. These are available both from Meaningful Australia or from Anchor Excellence. If your organisation is not a member of Meaningful Australia, can I suggest that you jump on their website and have a look? They've got the most fabulous resources, truly. And it may save you a lot of time and effort in trying to create resources where perhaps the skill base isn't evidenced across your organisation. For Anchor, policies and processes, particularly in the context of diversity, we have a particular spiritual care policy and process that sits in the diversity suite. All of these resources will really help your staff. Any of these resources are great stimulus materials for staff meetings, for resident meetings, and just to help your staff feel confident to have those difficult discussions that Carla talked about. We know that, some people have got the personal resilience to say, well, this is what I want in one or two conversations. But we also know for most people that it's a series of conversations. And as the awareness of their own mortality becomes more evident to themselves, they're more willing to engage at particular points along those trajectories that both Rachel and Carla described. So look, thank you so much for joining us. And again, just like to go back to one of the original slides where we truly dedicate this presentation to the people that work in palliative care during Palliative Care Week, and of course to the people that benefit from the skills and knowledge that the palliative care practitioners have. So thank you very, very much.